The very first, let's say, agricultural towns emerge in the Indus Valley, so just north of the Indian subcontinent, okay? And also in Mesopotamia, so here, okay, Syria, Iraq, Euphrates River, the Tigris River. In between the Euphrates and the Tigris, you get the earliest cities in civilization: Uruk, Ur, Sumer, Eridu. These are the names. They emerge in around about 3000 BC. Near contemporaneously to them, they're just a little bit before what's happening further south in Egypt. Okay, I don't have a map of Egypt. You know what Egypt looks like. Oh, here it is, Egypt. Okay, that's the Nile River, the Delta, the Nile Delta. Okay, right. Now, the most characteristic structure of these civilizations, we know from later textual evidence. Obviously, we've got these tablets that are very old. The kind of cuneiform tablets, you can even find some of these in the Vatican museums, okay? When you first enter the Vatican museums, they're about 5,000 years old. They're old. They're near contemporaneous with the earliest towns that become temple cities in Mesopotamia. But these sorts of temple structures, these ziggurats, they're also from about the mid-3rd century BC, mid-3rd millennium BC, 2600, 2700 BC. And they are the earliest monumental temples in the historical record. This is the partially reconstructed Mesopotamian ziggurat of Ur. Okay. The earliest chronicles that we have describing what these temples might be used for date from about 1500 years later or so, from about, well, 1500 BC, 1000 BC, around there. And they describe the creation myths of the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians later on. Babylon is here. Bad news, Babylon, okay? Right, that sounds like a rock song, you know. Bad news, Babylon. Okay, it's here, right? And basically, you have the description of what we call the cosmogony, the creation of the cosmos from a theological or, let's say, religious point of view, which happens something like this. So basic elements of the Sumerian cosmogony are stated in a poem called Enki and Eridu. Eridu is a city, right? The journey of the water god to Nippur. Nippur is another city, the earliest cities in existence. These are the separation of heaven, An, and earth, Ki, which are the offspring of the personification of the primeval waters, Namu, by their son, the demiurge Enlil. The demiurge is a creator god. The demiurge figures in all of these ancient religious myths, except for Greece, for whatever reason. Whether you're looking at Mesopotamian religion or Egyptian religion, there is primeval matter personified. So heaven and earth, the waters of the abyss that produce heaven and earth, right? It's something like that, of chaos. That's the Greek perception. But the waters, whether it's Namu here or the Nun in Egyptian religion, it's this expanse of ocean that's endless, okay? And heaven and earth come out of that. But they're shaped, and they're usually shaped by the demiurgos in Greek is the demiurge, the shaper, the maker god. And in ancient Mesopotamian religion, you have Enlil who does this early on. Later in Babylonian religion, it's Marduk, right? Marduk does this by getting Tiamat, his serpent mother, snapping her in half and making the heavens out of part of her body and the earth out of the other part of her body. Like, it's very violent stuff, right? It's really interesting. I don't know how anyone lived in this civilization, to be honest with you. You know, it's just, it's full on. But you do get some very interesting narratives that come out of it, which I'll go into, especially the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the very first buddy cop movie. But we'll get to that in a second, okay? Like Beverly Hills Cop or something like that, right? Like, look, you don't have these things unless they start somewhere, okay? Do you know what I'm talking about? Is Beverly Hills Cop a dead reference now? Is it gone? No. You don't know what Beverly Hills Cop is? Axel Foley, man. Eddie Murphy is Axel Foley. Billy Rosewood, they team up to fight the criminals in Beverly Hills with a lot of jokes, no? Yeah, some people are smiling. Okay. I'm not that old yet. All right. Why is all this talk about the cosmogony, the birth of the cosmos? Genesis in Greek is birth. Cosmos is universe, the birth of the universe. According to Mesopotamian religion, important. Why? because what they say, both in this text that we just mentioned, the Enki and Eridu text, and the later Babylonian text, it's pretty much unilateral, but it's there in the earlier text in particular, is that a cosmic mountain comes out of those waters. It's brought out of those waters by the demiurge god, Enki. So you have waters which are in a constant state of flux, and they represent both chaos and life. But in this context, it's chaos. It's like the flood waters in Noah's Ark in that story. Chaos and rebirth, double signification, multivalent symbolism, in other words, multiple significations. Water has positive and negative elements. It's the same with baptism. The sins are destroyed, original sin, but we're reborn in Christ. Yeah, this doesn't go away. It's universal, right? And the demiurge takes something stable out of those waters, namely earth, the hill. And upon that hill, the first temple or city is built. Well, that's what that's meant to represent, the ziggurat. The stepped pyramid, which is the first example of Sumerian monumental architecture, is meant to be an architectonic, if you like, or architectural exemplification of the primeval hill, which symbolizes order and stability in a world of chaos. Does that make sense? Now, this is politicized too, because it's from this vantage point that by the time you get to the Akkadians, Naram-Sin, the first ruler to identify himself with the goddess Inanna, comes Ishtar later on. He basically makes himself a god on earth, and then so there's his successor Sargon, and these are the first god kings, god rulers. They're not really god kings. You get what I mean? They depict themselves as god kings. Now, this is very relevant. It's the first evidence that we have for this, at least. Why is it very relevant? That by the mid-teens, 1600s, 1700s, around then BC, you get the first god king rulers. What do you think? What happens eventually? You have it picked up by the ancient Greeks with Alexander the Great. He becomes a god king. Then Julius Caesar becomes divinized when he dies. Then Augustus, his adopted nephew, the first, I think, imperial emperor or imperial ruler of Rome, becomes a god in his lifetime. And all of a sudden, Jesus is born within those circumstances to overthrow the perception concerning human beings that exalt themselves as divine. And that plays out in the life of the earliest Christian communities because they refuse to worship the Roman emperor as a god. All comes out of here. It all begins here. It's a lot of idolatry in this context, right? Human kings worshipped as gods. And the church's position towards idolatry is very complex. It's not straightforward. It's like you don't worship the statue and what it represents, but you can read the texts, kind of thing. That happens very early on in the church's development. So you can read these stories and enjoy them, but you can't, especially the Greek and Roman stories. But we'll talk about that down the track. This is Nebuchadnezzar the First's Etemenanki ziggurat. Etemenanki, I think it means house, house, temple, palace, where the foundation of heaven and earth is. So not only is this primeval mound that's concretized as a ziggurat, a step pyramid, symbolizing order in the cosmos, but because it is vertical, reaching up to the sky and begins on the earth, it's at the intersection between heaven and earth. This is what Eliade called an axis mundi, a center of the world, because the world is both summarized here within the mountain, because the mountain depicts the emergence of order out of chaos in their early creation myths, but it also intersects heaven and earth because of its vertical orientation. Does that make sense? Right. And that's the earliest example. Also, it's a landing pad. The gods come down and stand on top of it, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, and then. Pardon? Did you turn the air conditioning on? I don't know how. Thank you. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, goes to turn on the aircon. All right. So, yes, what was your question?
Like, why do they make themselves a god king? Do they worship or respect differently than just a regular king? Like, why do they see the need to make themselves in the same level as a god?
Yeah, probably population control on some level. But they might have believed that because the goddess that, and it's a goddess initially that Naram-Sin and Sargon identify themselves with, Inanna, who becomes Ishtar. That goddess held all of the mes or the me, which are the principles of order in the cosmos. So if she was believed to hold all the principles of order in the cosmos, then if the king represents himself as a god on earth, as her son, but who's also semi-divine, then he holds all the principles of order in the cosmos, which means that he has absolute power. Yeah. And, the Egyptian pharaohs were similar. They're a bit more benevolent at times, and they're not like these guys. Egypt is very, very complex. It can't be seen as authoritarian, top-down, destructive to the lowest common denominator, even though it did that to the people of Israel for a time, probably under Ramses II. We don't know, during Moses' time. But the king in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh, associated himself with the principle of stability or order known as Ma'at, who was a goddess. Ma'at, right? So that's all part and parcel of this. And you have more about the creation story in the Enuma Elish, another famous story that talks about the way that the cosmos is arranged. And that introduces Marduk, the Babylonian hero god, who fights against, Tiamat and makes the cosmos out of her remains. And you can read this stuff in your own time, okay? If you're interested in it. I think it's really interesting stuff. There is representation of Marduk. See, he's winged. He's a demigod, yeah? So the wings here and fly in heaven, right? And look, I mean, imagine how these people looked, right? The way that they dressed. It would have been very striking. Makeup, long beards, like dreadlocked beards, It's really otherworldly stuff, right? In a sense. And he's chasing Tiamat, who's zoanthropomorphic. She's like an eagle with talons, representation of chaos and evil. This stuff doesn't go away. It's picked up again by the Gnostics, early Christian heretics later on. This kind of way of envisaging the world made out of evil, out of the carcasses of an evil god, out of evil demons. That was the belief of the Manichaeans that Augustine refuted. It's not irrelevant to what we're doing and to Christianity. These things do not go away, right? There it is. That was a drawing. Here's the actual bas relief from the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, from the 9th century BC in the British Museum. Cool, huh? Oh, yeah, it's pretty cool. And there's Gilgamesh at Sydney Uni. Has anyone seen Gilgamesh at Sydney Uni? No? He's near the gym. And across from the big field there. Go visit Gilgamesh one day if you're in Sydney Uni. You can check him out. Okay, why this text is very, very interesting, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is because you would not have the kind of language or conceptual terminology to describe the Christian perception of hell or the underworld if this text didn't exist. I'm not saying Christianity rips it off, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to have a starting point for these themes and leitmotifs in the literature. And it's here. Coming out of the 3rd millennium BC. Of course, that's when he probably lived, and the text exists in fragments from that period, and there are larger, let's say, stelated fragments over a period of about 1,500 years that have more and more of the text on them. The plot of the epic: Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, another one of those early cities, is semi-divine and does not heed the gods. The wild man, Enkidu, his buddy, right, is captured with a prostitute as bait and brought to him. They wrestle and become great friends. Just like any good action movie would begin from the 1980s, starring Kurt Russell. And, the second episode sees them journeying to the cedar forests, guarded by Humbaba, an evil creature. Then Enkidu's hand is withered when he opens the gate. Gilgamesh, and it's written very bizarrely with a lot of repetition because that's how they memorized these things. So if you read the actual English translation of the excerpts, like the translation of these texts, it's like bizarre reading. It's like entering another cosmos. It's great. It's great. Gilgamesh falls into a mystical sleep after felling a sacred cedar, a tree. And Humbaba is only defeated with the help of Shamash, the sun god, and the winds. Sun god, very important. Emerges in this context. Shamash is the main deity worshipped by the Babylonians. And later on, like there are other nefarious deities like Baal, those that feature in the Old Testament, right? The bad guys of the God of Israel, of Yahweh. But eventually, the solar worship becomes very prominent in ancient Egypt. The god Ra, Amun-Ra in particular, that the pharaoh is a son of and representative of. Alexander the Great will depict himself as a sun god. It becomes very popular in the Roman Empire, all the way up until the time of Christianity becoming the main religion of the Roman Empire. There's a kind of a standoff between Christianity and the worship of the sun, right? This is why this is all relevant. Okay. Gilgamesh's coronation comes after his triumph, and Ishtar, the goddess of sex and love, she's like Aphrodite, Inanna beforehand, desires him. Gilgamesh rejects her. This is very interesting because you see these kind of things come up later with Hercules rejecting, do you remember the story? Do you know the story? Hercules is presented with a representation of virtue and a representation of vice. And vice is a voluptuous prostitute, gold dangling. She's enticing him. She's luring him. Very beautiful. And virtue is austere looking and severe, but she has all of the wisdom on her brow. And Hercules chooses virtue. Yeah. This stuff is old. It's really old. It's really, really good stuff. But it's also in the Proverbs as well. Beware, the seductress kind of thing, right? It's ancient stuff, guys. I'm not saying anything. It's not meant to be interpreted in a feminist way or anything else. I'm giving you the context, right? The contextualization is this, right? Ladies also exemplify wisdom, hence virtue, areti, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and so on and so forth, who is like the patroness of virtue. Okay, so what happens eventually when Gilgamesh rejects her? It shows that he cannot be tempted, right? He's tough. Okay. Then Enkidu dies. This is where I'm getting. This is where the meat of it is, right? Enkidu dies. After his rejection of Ishtar, Gilgamesh kills the bull of heaven, a monster set by the goddess to punish him. Doesn't it look a little bit like Hera harassing Hercules? A little bit. See, this stuff is archetypal in a sense. Because, Hera doesn't leave Hercules alone, right? Partly because she's jealous that Hercules was born of Alcmene, who Zeus slept with. Okay. We can talk about this stuff if you want when we do Greece. This stuff is really interesting. The Greek myths are the best. I'm all about bringing the Greek myths back. They're just so interesting and so fascinating. So the gods hold a council meeting, and Shamash, the sun god, is confronted by the storm god Enlil. He can save only one of the offenders, and he chooses Gilgamesh. And Enkidu sickens and dreams of death. He gets sick because there are variations in the story that he gets sent to fetch some tools from the underworld, some sticks and a drum. Gilgamesh's stick and drum. Hey, buddy, go get my stick and a drum. Like sending your friend off to war kind of thing, and not telling him. And he goes into the underworld, but Gilgamesh tells him, but just don't touch anything. He touches something in the underworld, and then the underworld ensnares him, and he dies in the underworld. And but he has these dreams beforehand, and the dreams are, last night I dreamed again, my friend. The heavens moaned and the earth replied. I stood alone by an awful being. His face was somber like the black bird of the storm. He fell upon me with the talons of an eagle. This is what he experienced in his dream, Enkidu. Well, he was like a premonition of the underworld, right? It's an omen of what's going to happen to him. Okay. Pinion with his claw till I smothered. Then he transformed me so that my arms became wings covered with feathers. He turned his stare towards me, and he led me away to the palace of Irkala, the queen of darkness, so the goddess of the underworld, to the house from which no one who enters ever returns, down the road from which there is no coming back. You start getting epic literature here, right? Which is essential for the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey stuff, Hero with 1,000 Faces. Does anybody know about that? Yeah, this is where it all gets written in a way that's very legible for us in the West, let's say. I mean, there are equivalents and very potent and interesting equivalents in Hindu religion and the Vedic scriptures, in the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita and various other texts, right? You find this, yeah, you're nodding. Yeah, so do you know what I'm referring to? Can you give an example? There's interesting stuff about death, the god of death, and people entering the underworld and coming back out again. Still this can resonate more directly in a sense, because geographically it's closer to what happens in Greece later on that becomes very much important for Western civilization. Not to say that the Hindu stuff isn't. It's very interesting and important in its own right. But so he ends up going to the underworld, and then Gilgamesh goes to visit him in the underworld, and he's sad that he cannot get his friend out of there.